Looks good?
Looks great.
Oops, okay, got it. Okay, thanks for the introduction, Molly. My contact information will be on this slide and also my last slide. So forest pathology is a huge topic. So if I don't get to what you're interested in, shoot me an email or call me and I'll do my best to respond. Might be a week or so till I catch up to my email, but I will make sure I get to you. Okay, before I get into the details of forest pathology, I wanted to start just by introducing myself, and Molly did a good job, but I'm part of a small group of just 4 pathologists and entomologists at DNR, and we do the sort of the bugs and cruds part of forest health. We cover everything that is on our state, industry, and private land. If you're on tribal or federal land, there are equivalent positions in the Forest Service that cover those. But we got to do a lot of fun things, and one awesome thing is the technical assistance and outreach, which includes things like this. So I'm happy to see you all. I wish we were in person, but it's nice that we can reach so many people all throughout Washington by doing talks like this. Now, DNR does a ton of stuff, and a lot of it I have no idea even what they do, but they did just make this landowner assistance portal. So I just put the URL there because if you have any questions about like cost sharing, etc., or finding your local forester to get onto your property, go there and you can do all those fun things. It's pretty easy. You can also just Google like Washington DNR landowner assistance portal and it should pop up. Okay, a little bit background about forest health before we get into the pathology side of it. This is just a brief reminder that tree health is very different than forest health. If you're just thinking about an individual tree, your considerations are much different than an entire forest. An individual tree, you're probably thinking about aesthetics, how long is it going to live, when's it going to fall, if it's going to fall, how safe it is, those type of things. When you're thinking about an entire forest, you're thinking about a much broader scale. You're thinking about what the entire forest does, and you're not focusing on single trees, you're focusing on the bigger picture, which can be tricky to do. So if we're focusing on an entire forest, what does a healthy forest look like? Well, we like to think that it has 3 things. First, that it provides basic ecosystem services. This is like the carbon sequestration, erosion control, basic wildlife habitat, all those things you consider with a generic forest. But also, a healthy forest is one that meets your landowner objectives. And this is where the definition of healthy forest varies between forest and landowner and landowner. Because it depends what you want out of it. Is it for recreation? Is it for wildlife? Is it for timber? All those things for what a healthy forest looks like varies. And then lastly, we want your forest to be resilient to disturbances. In other words, if you do get a stressor, a disease, a drought, an insect come into your forest, you want the forest to be able to respond to it and despite those pressures, still give you what you're looking for and provide these basic ecosystem services. So there's a lot of things out there that can impact your forest. Here's a list that's not inclusive of everything.
The next few weeks are the busiest.
Yep. And then I've split this up of what can impact a tree into abiotic, meaning non-living, and biotic, which is living things. Now, abiotic things will be covered in a couple of months by another pathologist, Betsy Goodrich. So make sure you log on to hear about those non-living things that can impact your tree. And then on the biotic or living side, we have a whole bunch of things. Insects will be covered by Molly next month, but I'm going to do my best to cover some or the most important things of the other living things that can impact a tree. In pretty much all cases for Washington Forest, we'll be focusing on fungi, but there are other random cool things you might come across in the forest. So huge diversity of things that can actually impact a tree. So before I start going into all these things that can kill trees, and some of you might find a little depressing, I want to remind you that these disturbance agents in moderation in particular, have a lot of positive impacts to our forest. They help provide natural thinning. They provide a lot of wildlife habitat, creating dead snags. They help decompose our wood so it can be reused into the forest and help our forest stay diverse. making scenarios where other tree species or other age species can take advantage and grow up. And so this is when I want to stress a healthy forest has a healthy amount of dead trees in it. I know you hear a lot about like fire risk and everything, and seeing some dead trees, especially ones that you look at all the time, can be scary. But a healthy forest on a large scale has dead trees in it, and it's not something to be scared about. It's a normal part of the process. Now, of course, there can be negative impacts to these disturbance agents, especially when they happen at large scales, or that they're caused by a non-native that can cause huge amounts of impact. And that's when we see economic and ecosystems costs that make the news and definitely make landowners worried. So all these disturbance agents really only can do three things to a tree. They can cause underdevelopment, meaning they'll slow down the growth of the tree. They can cause overdevelopment, meaning they cause too much growth in certain areas or weird areas of a tree, or they can cause necrosis or death of tissues. And because of that, it's important to remember that symptoms alone, just looking at the tree itself, is not always enough. We'll need to look closer at the tree and at the symptoms and try to figure out what's actually happening. Just because you have a slow developing tree doesn't mean we can tell exactly what it is without looking closer, for example. And it's a little complicated because it's not just the host and the pathogen or the disease or the pest interaction. We like to think of the full picture when we're talking about diseases of trees. And we do that by using this disease triangle. It's pretty common in pathology textbooks. And it just reminds you that you need a host, so in this case, a tree, an agent, in this case, a pathogen or a pest, and then a conducive environment, all to work together to cause disease. If you remove any of those three things or reduce any of those three things, you'll have less disease. If you increase all these three things, you will have more. So just a reminder to keep the full picture in your mind when out in your forest. So here's an example of why the disease triangle is important and thinking about all influences. If, for example, we're on the coast of Washington, you might have heard about Swiss needle cast disease. It's caused by a native fungus, Nothofaeocryptopus guamani. This fungus is found wherever Douglas fir, its only host is. However, you only see disease occur in cool, moist areas along the coast. You don't ever see it elsewhere in the state, despite both the host and the agent being present. So just a reminder, when you're out in your forest, think about the environment to help explain what you're seeing. It can be important. So if we're in person, I would ask you all to chip in and answer what the most important disturbance agent is. And I'm sure I'd get a lot of different answers, and that's because the correct answer is the one that's in your backyard. So all of you will have slightly different things going on in your forest or the forest you're walking in or exploring in. And I'm going to do my best to guess what you might see. But in no way in this talk can I cover everything out there. So my goal is to give you a little introduction on different things you might run into, just enough so you might recognize them and be able to look up more information. So today, my goal is to go briefly over one or two examples of each of these categories. We're going to touch on some root rots, heart rots, canker diseases, vascular wilts, foliar diseases, mistletoes, and animal damages that you might see impacting your trees. And this is just a way to categorize diseases based on the type of impact they have on the tree. So it's a good way to get a rough idea of the diversity of what's out there and then how we can manage it. Now, since I only have the rest of the hour to do this, I'll do my best to be brief. I'm not going to spend any time on management. My thought is if you can figure out what you have, it's much easier to then figure out in the literature online what to do about it or to reach out to Molly or me. It just takes so much time to talk all about the management of all these. We're going to skip that today for this broad introduction of pathology and just introduce you to these types of diseases and what you might see in the field. So first, root rot diseases. As a pathologist here in Washington, we spend the majority of our time dealing with root rot diseases. They're tricky because they are exactly what they sound. They're diseases, in this case caused by fungi in Washington, that rot the living roots of trees. And so you can see here a picture of decayed roots that were with a tree that was killed by root disease, and then a picture of healthy roots of a tree that fell over and still retained all of its roots. And none of those roots were killed. And the tricky thing with root rot diseases is most of what they're doing is underground, and we're above ground, and it's really difficult to notice them and figure out what's going on, despite them being very prevalent and common in a natural part of our forests. So root rot or root diseases life cycle are all pretty similar. I won't talk about these 3 root diseases in the next few slides, but I wanted to start by just sort of summarizing what they can do and what they might do and how they live. So root rot diseases, we already said, survive in the roots of trees and feed on living root tissue. They will kill trees, sometimes rapidly, sometimes slowly, but even after the tree dies, they're still living in that root tissue. They can spread from one tree root system to the next if the roots of neighboring trees contact them, and those are what those curved arrows are, showing you sort of the spread of the disease from root to root. And they'll sort of make these little disease pockets where you can see the spread progressing over time. Now, these are native pathogens, so it's a very slow progress in here. The trees have evolved with them, so they're not rapid tree killers. This is something that happens over many years, maybe expanding just a foot or so each year. The pathogen, to make things difficult, these can all survive in stumps for very long periods of time. We're talking decades, in which, despite the tree being killed, the fungus is still there, alive. And if you go ahead and plant new trees, those tree roots can spread and grow into those old stumps and also get infected.
Rachel, this one's just showing up as the blank slide. Oh, there.
Oh, oops, sorry. There we go. Sorry,
Hey,
y'all. I have 2 screens and one progressed and the other didn't. Thanks,
gotcha.
Molly. Okay, so now you can see the curved arrows and from infected stumps to neighboring trees of how root diseases spread throughout a stand. And I just want to give the rough sense of how these move in the system before we talk about what you might see, which is this side. The first thing you want to do if you're looking for root rot or trying to recognize it is look at the big picture at the stand level. And to do that, you first might notice pockets of symptomatic trees. All of a sudden, there's a cluster or an opening of like dead and dying trees. If you look around that cluster, you'll notice that there's several stages of slowly declining trees, meaning that there's recently killed ones, all the way to old and dead and decaying lying on the ground. The trees that are lying on the ground have failed mainly in their roots that have been rotted and are lying in all different directions, meaning that there wasn't a single wind event that pushed them all down in the same direction. This is something that's happening slowly over a long period of time as trees are falling all different directions. And then you might notice there's a regeneration of other species of trees or of young susceptibles trees coming in. So it's often really brushy, there's not really a canopy, and you're trying to figure out why that's the case. You should consider root diseases. You then want to look closer at these individual trees and look for more direct symptoms of root rot. Now, of course, the first thing you want to do is look for the actual decay in the roots themselves. So rotted wood, nothing you would want to burn in your fire pit, stuff that's just not, or like carve out of stuff that's like not really structural. And that's the number one thing we look for. Other things you may come across is you might see resinosis on the root collar where the tree is pitching out. That's a sign that something is happening at the base of a tree, and the tree is reacting to it. Maybe a root disease, may not, just means we should look further into it. You might also see thin and discolored crowns. This can be caused by a bunch of things, but it definitely is common with root rot impacted trees. They tend to thin out from the bottom up and the inside out, as the picture shows on the right, unlike drought, which is the outside in and the top down. You may also see reduced growth. A good way to look at this is you just look at that leading top branch, the branch that you would put a Christmas tree star on, and see how tall and pointy it is. In the picture here, you can see the top is really rounded. That's indicating a tree that's not putting on much growth. It's no longer putting on a nice big leader. You may notice distressed cone crops. This is sort of a last-ditch effort a tree does to produce cones before it dies, and these cones tend to be sort of out of sync with neighboring trees, smaller, deformed, just not quite right compared to what a healthy tree is doing. And then Molly will talk about bark beetles next month, but you may come across bark beetles and root rot disease pockets. So if you see bark beetles, think about root diseases, and if you see root diseases, keep an eye out for bark beetles. Now, I mentioned that there's 3 main root rot diseases in Washington. I'm not going to go into all this, but I just wanted to give a little pathology apology to everyone here. Things have been called a lot of different names over the time, over even just recent history, and it can get very confusing. So I call these diseases laminated root rot, armillaria root rot, and heterobasidian root rot. If you look underneath here, these are other names that have been called these diseases in the past. And then same with the scientific names. We have had a variety of scientific names applied to these different things. Same fungus, we're just learning more about it, especially with genetics, we're assigning it to a different area. So just keep in mind, you might see different names assigned to the same organism, depending on the age of the literature you're reading out there when you learn more. And that's my apology for the confusion. It's just something we live with. If you want to identify specific root rot, the first thing you want to do is determine which tree species are being impacted, and that is because different tree species are susceptible to different root diseases. It's not black and white, so most of the guides out there sort of use a gradient. In this case, this table uses a 1, 2, 3, 4 to show what root diseases, for this case, laminated root rot, will impact what tree species. And we see Douglas fir and true firs as some of the higher ones. And I'll give you a link to this table at the end of this talk, since it's not a complete table and it's important to know. And then here's an example of an old scientific or old common name now being called heterobasidian root disease. Still an accurate table, just keeping you on your toes. So once you know what trees are being impacted, you then want to look for the rot in the roots of the tree. And look for the fungus itself. And so this is a messy process. We usually use Pulaski's to dig away soil and to hack into roots, but you can use a shovel and a hand axe. If you're not spending a lot of time doing this and getting dirty, you probably won't be digging enough and finding what you're looking for. This is a hard process to do. I like to target old dead stumps and fallen trees first, because those are sometimes the most easy things to see. And then at the very end, go to symptomatic or recently killed trees. And so what will you actually see? It depends on what root rot species you're looking for. For example, if you have a root rot disease site with laminated root disease, you start poking around these stumps, you might see sort of delamination of some really old rotted material. That's the first thing, where like the actual tree rings start to split off into almost pages. It's a misnomer. It should be called delaminated root rot, not laminated. You then, probably with the help of a extension forester or a pathologist like us, can look for the actual fungus itself. This takes a hand lens to see. It's really hard to see. It's like this peach fuzz. This is actual structures the fungus produces that are unique to laminated root rot fungi. And once you see that, you know what you're dealing with. You may pull back the dirt and see sort of a white coloration on the roots there. And that's sort of we call it ectotrophic mycelium, but it's just fungal growth on the surface of the roots that is common with laminated root rot. Sometimes you find it, sometimes you don't. There are other lookalikes though. And then there's the hard to find fruiting bodies that are uncommon, but you may come around this sort of like mud looking structure that's actually the fruiting body of the fungus, where it releases airborne spores. Armillaria root rot will be a little different. It causes a white rot in roots, not that delamination. And when you peel back the bark on the base of a tree or lower down on the roots, you'll see this white mycelial fan growing between the bark and the wood itself. You may see these black rhizomorphs. This is just a structure of the fungus that almost looks like shoestrings growing between the bark and the wood. And then at rare times, you may come across these honey mushrooms, these brown mushrooms. that armillaria root rot produces. Now, there's a lot of different species of fungi out there that have nothing to do with root diseases that produce very similar brown mushrooms. So don't panic every time you see a brown mushroom. It's a rare case you find these, and their absence means nothing. And the presence of another brown mushroom doesn't mean that your trees are being impacted either. And then lastly, most tricky, we have heterobasidian root rot. Usually we start by crossing out the other two root diseases and then narrowing down. You can have delamination again, not as common, but still possible. But mostly you get this stringy white rot, sometimes with embedded black flecks in here. Now in pictures, it kind of looks like dirt, but in person, you can see those black flecks are actually in the rot itself. And then if you work really hard and do a lot of digging into the stumps and underneath litter, you can find these fruiting bodies. In this case, it's conchs, but they're uncommon. So it's fun to find them, but not easy to do. And their absence doesn't mean you don't have heterobasidian root rot, and their presence, you want to make sure you're looking at the right conch, because there's a lot of conchs out there. Nothing you see walking around will be this conch. You have to go digging for it underneath like the litter or into stumps. So here's a little bit about management that I'm going to skip through really quickly since we don't have tons of time. But the main thing you want to do is manage your tree species on your site. That's the most practical thing if you do anything at all. Now there's a lot of different root rots out there. I covered the main three, but keep your eyes open for other things you may come across. And I'll point you towards some literature at the end of this that will direct you there. Okay. Hold on, Molly. I'm just going to do one thing real quick.
All good. Take your time.
Okay, yep, just want to make sure I'm giving you guys the most updated one. So we have done root diseases. We're going to move on to heart rots. Just a brief introduction to heart rots. And I'm going through these other categories fairly quickly. Root diseases are the most complicated ones. Heart rots are exactly what they sound like. They're rot, in this case fungi again, that cause decay in sort of the center of the tree. Now this isn't down in the roots, this is the main stem of the tree. In Washington, this is an old tree problem. So if you are interested in timber, you never have this problem because your tree never gets as old. But in old growth forest or on older trees, it's not uncommon to see. It often isn't a big deal unless you want timber, as these trees usually can stand with, here, I'll point to it, this structurally sound wood around the edge just fine. For example, in Washington, you often come across red ring or white speck rot. This is caused by Cordelia pinei, which can infect most conifers. It produces these conchs that you may see that are kind of rough looking on the undertop and sort of grayish on the top. And they're pretty common. This is the fruiting body that releases airborne spores, and they can travel to other trees and infect them. The process is really slow, and causing rot is really long, so you only get decay and impact on older trees. If you're doing some management, you might see sort of a reddish stain in some of these tree stems you cut, but it'll develop into this advanced decay on older infected trees where you see this white pocket decay. And there's a lot of heart rots out there, and they often produce these cool conchs you see in the forest. Here's a few here. The one I want to point out is this brown crumbly rot or red belt fungus. This is so common in our woods here. When you're walking around, you often see it. It is one of our main decomposers out there. And it's fun to see because it only impacts dead wood. So if you see it on the tree, it's a dead tree, or at least a dead portion of the tree. It's not causing any impact. It's just helping the forest decompose. So just a fun one to see when you're out there. Moving on to canker diseases. There are a few canker diseases in Washington, not a lot, that impact our forests. Cankers are just sort of the death of the outermost layers of the tree, referred to bark if you are a clumper and not a splitter, as you can see in this picture here. Now with cankers, the impact varies based on if the canker causes girdling. And girdling is the complete death of the bark around the entire circumference of a stem. So if you would kill all the way around a stem, as pictured there with that orange, that is what girdling happens. And then the impact of this depends on if complete girdling happens or not, and where it happens. So if you have complete girdling just on a branch, you'll just lose a portion of the tree and the tree can survive. If you have it on the top, you might lose the top of the tree, but the bottom will recover. But if you have it lower down, you can lose the entire tree. So our main canker-causing fungus that we have to care about in Washington is white pine blister rust. This is a big deal. This is a non-native fungus that was introduced to the US around 1900 when we were moving a lot of pine seedlings around the world for reforestation efforts from Asia to Europe to here. Here's some pictures of cankers. Let's look at them more closely. What you might see in pine trees is stem and gall rust, meaning that it impacts the actual stems and forms sort of these slight swellings or sunken cankers, depending on where in the tree and how the tree responds. And then if you look closely, you might see white or orange pustules on the canker itself. So usually from afar, it starts by just a flagging, a single branch being red, and you're like, why is only that branch dead? You look closer, you see a canker or swelling on the stem. And the problem with this non-native disease is the tree can't respond to it fast enough. So it's able to spread from its infection point on a branch into the stem, down the stem, and end up girdling the entire tree. So here's some example of those cankers on the stems of trees. And this one is producing, you can see the fungus itself, this white portion. The interesting thing with white pine blister rust is that it needs two completely unrelated hosts to survive. So we just saw pictures of our white pines and our 5-needle white pines from Washington. That's our western white pine and our white bark pines. This is not ponderosa pine. This is not lodgepole pine or shore pine. This is just our 5-needle pines. But it also needs another host, and in this case, it needs ribes species, which is where it causes foliar rust. And you'll see on these ribes, such as currants or gooseberries, this sort of light orange discoloration on the underside of leaves. And it does very little damage to this tree, this ribes species, while in pines, it does a very good job of killing the pines. So what is the impact of this? The impact of this disease has been pretty extreme. It has caused damage. It has caused mortality on large stands. It has especially impacted in Washington, Idaho, our western white pine timber species, which is not really a thing anymore because of it. But is also, this picture here, has caused our white bark pines to become recently listed as threatened, as it's impacting these sort of high elevation trees. Now, these white bark pine trees aren't ones you'll have in your yard, but they are ones you might come across if you're hiking in higher elevations. I'm going to skip that slide because I don't think we have time for management. But there's a few other canker disease you might come across. Sudden oak death is one you might hear about, Phytophthora ramorum. In Washington, unlike Oregon and California, it is yet to kill any of our forest trees. It's just sort of a foliar disease in nursery settings at this point. If it does end up in our natural forests, probably our large trees are at highest risk, and it's where it causes cankers on those. I just want to say it is unlikely to impact our Oregon white oak, despite the sudden oak death name. It's a little misleading. Our oak should be fine. But there's a few other things you can see. Probably one of the most common ones is you might see western gall rust on some of our other pines, not our 5-needle pines, but ponderosa or lodgepole, for example. Okay, moving on, vascular wilts. Vascular wilts are diseases that impact the vascular system, usually by clogging it. So here's a picture where you can imagine a cross-section of tree where the xylem sort of on the edges is moving water and minerals up the tree. And then on the right, you can imagine if there's some pathogen that clogs portion of that, it would impact the tree. Oops, I'm sorry. Oh no, that's fine. This is just some examples of what you might see if you have a vascular disease. You might see wilting of leaves, flagging, terminal dieback, decline, and death. Often if you cut into a stem of a tree with these symptoms, you might see discoloration of the xylem where the actual clogging is happening. You rarely can see the actual biotic agent, like the actual fungus or bacteria causing this. That typically needs a lab culture to do that. So it's one of those ones where you just see symptoms and to get the signs, you actually have to go to a lab to confirm. In Washington, one of our newly emerging diseases is sooty bark disease of maples. This is a vascular wilt disease. Is caused by the fungus Cryptostroma corticale. It may or may not be native. We don't know yet. We do know that in Europe, where it is non-native, it impacts their maple species. Here in Washington, that may be our big leaf maples, our vine maples, and our ornamentals, but we're not really certain what that means or how well it can impact our trees yet. So there's a lot of question marks for this pathogen and what it may mean to our forest here. On trees, you may notice these sort of black sunken areas that are pretty patchy and well defined. These are sunken into the bark, but don't go all the way to the wood. So it's not on the surface of the bark. The surface of the bark is peeled off, and then you see a sunken patch with these black patches underneath. Yeah, and as I said, there's not lots known about this. We're definitely seeing it in urban areas in Western Washington, and it's something that we hope to learn more about in the future. So we can tell you more about it, whether it's native, a big deal, or not big deal, to be determined, but something that despite producing fruiting bodies on the outside of the tree, kills trees in Europe by clogging that internal vascular tissue. You might come across other vascular wilts in Washington, very uncommon. Maybe in urban areas, you might see verticillium wilt on maples. And then if you have any planted elm trees, Dutch elm disease has taken our native elms out on the eastern United States, but hasn't been really a big deal here since we don't have any native elms. And then moving on to foliar diseases, these are diseases that infect the foliage, whether it's needles or broadleafs of a tree, and then cause disease just on the foliage themselves. These are often the most obvious diseases you see, and can be a problem or at least obvious when we have moist, cool springs, when you have those young, delicate needles or leaves coming out. With moist, cool conditions that fungi love. It's just it's a perfect time for infection to happen. The good thing about foliar diseases is that their impact tends to be really minimal. Trees are prepared to have some of their foliage lost, whether it's by a deer eating it or some insects feeding on it, or in this case, a fungus, a foliar disease. So trees produce more foliage than they need, and in the majority of cases, foliage diseases are something you see, you notice, you appreciate, and you do nothing about. So they're really fun in that sense. For example, larch needle cast and blight, that's one of these foliage diseases we see, we appreciate, and then we don't do anything about. If you're in Eastern Washington, you might have noticed this a few years ago, but if we have a really cool wet spring, those larch needles can look pretty yellow and gray, starting fairly early on in the summer. And this is caused by two native fungi that produce what we refer to as either larch needle cast or larch needle blight. You can see some pictures there. And you know what? There's a chance that this slows down growth, but the larch trees recover in the majority of circumstances, and it's nothing we manage for or really worry about, but it is something very visually obvious. Lots of other funky foliar diseases out there. One cool one is you might see needle rust, where these like crazy orange teeth-like things come out. But lots of cool things to keep your eye out. If they're just on the foliage themselves, then you typically don't have to do anything to manage for it. I did want to briefly mention mistletoes because they're super fun. Mistletoes are parasitic flowering plants, but they obtain some level of water or nutrients or carbon from another plant. In our trees, they often cause stunting and deformation. So, for example, you might come across the hemlock mistletoe. This is a native dwarf mistletoe found mainly on western hemlock. And you'll see sort of these witches' brooms here. This is when the tree produces too many branches in one area, and there will be a mistletoe infection in there. If you're there in the right time of year, you can see these actual different plant bodies, like not hemlock, sprouting out of usually these swellings in these witches' brooms. And that's the parasitic plant. There's sort of a forest by forest issue. If you're going for maximum tree growth, they can be a problem. Especially since they can deform stems. But if you're going for wildlife, they can make some really cool wildlife structures in some of these brooms. So depending on what you're managing for, they can be a good or a bad thing. There's a lot of mistletoes, dwarf mistletoes out there in Washington that impact conifers. There's usually a mistletoe species per each conifer species generally. So here's some pictures of Douglas fir mistletoe, and these are smaller mistletoe fruiting bodies, but you can still see them sometimes on leaves, especially if you start poking around those brooms when you come across those infected trees on the east side. And then lastly, never forget about animals. I'm going to talk about wild animals. What I don't talk about are human animals, which do the craziest and weirdest things to trees, cause all sorts of problems. And always on your back of your mind, you should be like, was this a human that caused this? Before switching to an animal, because oftentimes the answer is yes. But wild animals are pretty fun and do some cool damage to trees too. For example, sapsuckers, they pick trees that they just like. It seems to be random at times and keep on coming back to them. And they'll peck out these little tiny bark holes. They don't go into the wood themselves. The sap will emerge from them. And the sapsucker will feed on both the sap, but also the insects that are attracted to the sap. And they make these really distinct straight lines, or mostly straight lines, sometimes even crazy patterns. And it's a good one to know because you will see this out in the field. And you want to know how this looks different than beetle damage or woodpecker damage, because these are nice, neat, straight lines, or at least some pattern to them. Unlike beetles or woodpeckers, will be random. A lot of other things out here. Just to pick one fun one to talk about, bear damage is one you'll see, where bears in the spring looking for some extra food and sugar will actually strip young conifer bark off to get to any of that sugar there, and you'll sometimes see this walking around in the woods. But there's of course other things, and again, logging in humans is my last one there, and that's a huge one to always keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so I'm just going to wrap up since I'm nearing the 45-minute mark of this hour. There's a lot of things that are happening in your forest, and there's a lot of different management techniques that we didn't really have time to go into today. But overall, your goal in your forest should be resiliency, meaning that it can sort of take whatever the future throws at it, and still sort of keep its baseline functioning. If you ask me how to do that, my two pieces of advice would be to think about diversity, not just tree species diversity, which is important, but also age diversity, structure diversity, density diversity. It's just not putting all your eggs in the same basket, since we don't always know what will be best in the future. The other thing to keep in mind is tree vigor. Just try to be nice to your trees, and don't do anything to stress them out, because a stressed tree can often lead to a dead tree. And then I want to remind everyone that be aware that nothing in a forest is static. If your management goal, which is fairly common, even if people don't say it, is to keep your forest exactly how it is the day you bought the forest, or started managing it, or when you bought the house, or when your parents got the house. If that's your goal, you're not going to be successful. A healthy forest changes, trees die, some get bigger, different species survive. So just build that into your future plans with your forest. Keep in mind that nothing is static. Okay, there's a bunch of resources here, and when I'm done showing this slideshow, I can try to put them in the chat, or you can take a picture with your phone or whatnot of them, or email me at the end and I can send you the links. The first thing, if you want to know more about just forest health in a given year in Washington, we produce our annual forest health highlights in Washington every year. This is our 2022 one, which is available online with this link. And our 2023 one is just being finalized, and hopefully will be out in the next couple of weeks. And that's when you can read about what we're seeing in our forest every year. We also do an aerial survey, and you can see the results of that, where we fly the majority of forested land in Washington. We do skip some of the city land, or if there's a fire, we have to avoid those. And we give a sort of a broad sense of what's happening in your general area and what we're seeing from the sky, so that can be fun to look into and see what we think what's happening from above, though we always need to ground truth things, especially before we make any decisions about what to do about it. There's a couple good guides out there, and again, you can email me for these links if that's the easiest way. The Forest Service produces this field guide to common diseases and insect pests that go through a good identification pamphlet. It has really everything I talked about. There's a page in here and has good summary sheets. And actually this link here is of an old scanned copy. If you email me, I just got the newer link and I thought I updated it, must not have saved. But there is a brand new PDF with updated pictures and a much better version that just actually got posted today. So I'm happy to share that one. And then once you know what you have in your forest, it's nice to go to this OSU publication. Unfortunately, we don't have one specifically for Washington, but I've read through this and it applies well to Washington. And that's when you can read discussions about what to do. For example, if you have root disease, you can then go to this and be like, okay, I know what I have. What are my options if I want to do anything all about it? And it's a good discussion for that. And with that, here is my contact information. Feel free to email me for those URL links if I don't get them, especially the updated one for the insect and disease one on the chat right now, and my phone number. And I know that was really brief. I try to touch on lots of little things you might see out there. I'm happy to follow up if any of you guys have specific things in your forest. Sometimes it's best to do that via pictures on email. But happy to take any questions.
That was so excellent. That was so interesting. Oh God.
So,
You in your little flight suit.
oh
That
my gosh. Okay.
scares me beyond belief. Rachel loves it. Thank
It's pretty
goodness
fun.
for Rachel.
Mhm.
We do have a few questions here. And
Yeah.
actually, Rachel, somebody asked, wait, if you have any just like general strategies that you could recommend to people that are most likely to prevent spread of pathogens.
Yeah, so a lot of our native diseases, a lot of what I talked about were native diseases today. The root diseases, the foliar diseases, a lot of those are native and they're here. They're not like, you're not going to spread them by going about your day to day. The ones we really need to worry about spreading are the non-native ones. And there's more emerging non-native insects, I think, at this time in Washington than there are pathogens. But there are a few. For example, sudden oak death is caused by Phytophthora ramorum. It is a water mold, which is like a fungus-like organism. It can be moved in nursery stock and in like soil as you're moving between places. So it's always good to like use local materials and like clean things before you go. You don't have to get crazy with like chemicals or anything, but if there's like chunks of dirt, it's always a good idea to get rid of those. And you,
That's good.
especially with plant seeds, you don't want to be moving dirt around too much.
That's-
Other things, it's too late, like the white pine blister rust, it produces airborne spores that can travel for hundreds of miles. So you don't have to worry about moving that one around because it's already here. So it sort of depends, but it's always a good idea just to try to limit movement of plant material, firewood, that type of thing, if possible.
Excellent. Oh, Rachel, do you mind switching back to this the slide where you had your contact information so folks are asking for it?
I'm going to put it in the chat because then they can
Perfect.
copy and paste it too. Let me do that before switching, assuming I can figure that out.
Patty just added a plug for the Washington Farm Forestry Association, which is fantastic. A lot of our contributors are part of that organization, and we will be working closely with them going forward, hopefully as much as possible for upcoming programming. But yeah, they're just a really fantastic, very personable, very I don't know. Yeah, neighbor to neighbor help is a really beautiful way of putting it. And also Patty wanted to know, Rachel, what region are you located in?
Oh, sorry for not saying that. I'm based at Olympia, but do cover with my colleagues the entire state. So, especially you guys who are far from the capital, don't be scared to say hi.
Okay, I got a good one here. Any recommendations regarding what to do with stumps or trees with various rots? Should we not chip and spread? Are there downsides to letting them just decay in place?
Yeah, so if you're referring to root rot diseases,
I think so.
yeah, so all the ones you'll find in our forests in Washington are caused by native fungi. And the good part, despite them being really difficult and annoying for forest managers, depending on their management goals, the good part is they're difficult to spread. Even in like some past research with grad students trying to like take root samples that are infected and like bury it next to a seedling and try to get that infected. It's a very, very hard to do that. It does it very well itself, but once we get involved, it's difficult. So you can still harvest these trees. You can still pull the stumps from the ground if that's what you're planning to do. You're not going to make any big differences by doing that for our root diseases or our heart rots or things like that. I think the bigger consequence is if you're moving like firewood pretty far. We have the emerald ash borer that I'm sure will come up next month, which is a good example of the risks of other things you can move in firewood and other wood. That would be a big deal.
Great.
But luckily for root diseases, it's not a big deal currently in
Awesome.
Washington. Yeah.
So that kind of keeping with that theme, are conchs in general okay to keep around for decay, or should we worry about the spores spreading to other trees?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, feel free to leave those conchs around. Most of the conchs you see, it's sort of like the apple on the apple tree. The conch is like the apple. You can remove the apple, but the tree's still there. It's far. The conch is not going to do anything.
Nice.
Most conchs produce airborne spores that are well dispersed in our environment, and removing one conch is not going to change anything or
Great.
decrease the risk of neighboring trees. So you can leave them there. They're really cool to look at.
And then someone said, is girdling also caused by animals? Someone replied, bucks rubbing their antlers is an example of this.
Yeah,
Yeah,
so girdling is when anything kills the outside tissue of a tree completely around its stem. So diseases do it, insects do it, animals do it, humans certainly do it all the time. Yeah, that's just what we call when the tissue all the way around is being killed.
perfect. And I think, hang on, I just want to check the
Yeah.
chat real quick. It seems laminated root rot can manifest early in different ways. I've noticed way more branches coming down this past winter on Doug fir. Is an increase in falling branches an early sign? These are 100-plus-year-old trees.
I I don't think I would have ever seen branches falling off as a direct correlation to laminated root disease.
Okay.
I mean, you can see like thinning foliage and slower growth on the top, but with old trees, that's just, some trees are just
They're
growing
just
slow
old.
anyways.
Yeah.
And this is a good plug to say that our trees here do, like most trees, they self-prune, meaning that they don't keep all the foliage and branches they ever produce forever. Um, and so those lower branches, especially when they stop getting sunlight or the tree has enough upper branches, will just be shed and dropped. And that's a sign of a healthy tree. It can be startling though if 10 years ago you looked out your window and there was all these lower branches and it seemed really green and these trees are growing up, and now all of a sudden you just don't see any green because it's all higher up. That can definitely be startling to landowners at times, or if you're like visiting your parents and you don't go very often, you can notice that change.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you can always send pictures, like if they're just the lower branches falling off, I wouldn't be too worried. If it's more extreme, then maybe send me a few pictures and we can go from there.
Okay, last question for you here.
Oh
You
yeah.
did such a good job answering these. These are
Mhm.
terrific. How far, oh, and okay, how far does ribes, is that the right way to pronounce it? Okay,
Yeah.
spread rust. If they're in my yard, but I don't have any white pine around, is that okay? Someone wants to know?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's really fun to go back in history and look at all the different management attempts we did as a country when this invasive disease was first found. So first we tried to, and I didn't have time to go into the cool life cycle of rust. It's really complicated and cool, and interesting how it requires two species. We tried a lot of things, and one thing was we spent as a country a ton of money to send young guys out into the forest, sort of like a military operation to get rid of these ribes species throughout East Coast, West Coast, wherever there were pines, to try to limit that. And it was not a success. These spores, it turns out, can sometimes travel hundreds of miles. So despite there actually being some laws still in the book, especially on East Coast states, about what ribes you can plant, if you don't have any white pines, I would leave them. They're cool plants. Wouldn't worry about
Cool,
it. Mhm.
cool.
So
Well, thank you so much, Rachel.
mhm.
This was crucial. We are so excited that you were able to stop through, stay extra late at work today. Thank you so much. The people in the chat love you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you everyone for, staying up a little bit later on a work night to join us. We would all love any sort of feedback that you would like to provide. The reason that we scheduled it this way is that hopefully it wouldn't interfere with like work or childcare. But if you would like it, I used to do it an hour later. Some people like that, because it's after dinner. Any kind of feedback like that is really helpful. Also, in the future, I would like to start offering SAF and ISA credits. If you guys think that that would apply to you, let me know if that's something that would be useful. Pesticide credits as applicable. And then again, I just put my contact information in the chat, but if anybody is at all interested in joining us with this initiative, the more the merrier. We would love to have you. Okay, I will stop with the plugs. Sorry.
No, the
for
plugs
this-
are great. We need
Oh, good.
plugs.
Good.
A reminder, this group is here for you guys, so feel free to push us in the direction that makes sense. We're guessing the best we can.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. Yeah. Trying to anticipate your needs, and sometimes we can be off base. So let us know. There was one other thing. Thank you for being flexible about the Zoom link. I don't know what happened. They said that they've been having this issue a lot lately, so that's great. But the new one that I sent you guys should work for all future webinars that we have for this series. So I will see you on April 24th, and also stay tuned for some additional announcements. We've got some really exciting programming coming up. Okay, and with that.